evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Alger. I'm the director of the Russell Museum. So glad to see everyone here. Could you indulge me and let me know, by show of hands, who has never been to the museum before? Great. That's terrific. That's terrific. So welcome, and welcome back to the many other folks who we see often. So thank you very much. A couple of notes before we start. One is, if you have been here before, if you're a regular and enjoy this programming, if you're new and you decide you do like this programming, we are looking for our lecture series to be, at some point, self-sustaining. So if you decide that you liked it, there are some donation envelopes that are on the security desk on the way out, and if you choose to give, you can give it to our friendly, smiling security officer down at the desk. I'm going to pass around this clipboard. If you are not signed up for our mailing list, you are welcome to do so. And just one housekeeping note about after this discussion up here is over. When you proceed down the stairs, you will first see Alice Flaherty, one of our speakers this evening, demonstrating an innovation of hers that they will be talking about. And then basically almost directly underneath me, toward the back of the museum, Pagan Kennedy will be signing her book, Inventology. We have the book for sale here. So just so you know that all that will be happening downstairs afterward. And so on to our program. I have to say this, I'm having a major fangirl moment right now, because before I was here, I was a magazine editor, and I would get my New York Times Magazine every week, and a number of years ago, I wait for this column called Who Made That? And I think, what are they going to do this week? It's going to be rubber bands, it's going to be sliced bread, and they were always just so beautifully written, so tightly edited, and just so terrific. So I am so pleased that Pagan Kennedy is here with us tonight. So clearly she was the Who Made That columnist. She's the author of 11 books. She was an MIT Knight Science Journalism Fellow. She is a Massachusetts Book Prize, has a Massachusetts Book Prize honor in nonfiction, and she's received a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. And for Inventology, which came out a few months ago and which she'll be talking about tonight, she received a starred Kirkus Review. So with that, let's welcome Pagan Kennedy.
Thanks for that very kind introduction. And I'm so happy to be here. And this is very James Bond here. I feel like I should be sharing, I don't know, my plan for world destruction. Yeah. I don't think I need to. I think other people will take care of that. So, as Sarah very kindly mentioned, I was worked on the Who Made, or writing the Who Made That column for the Times for 2 years, and so this was a job I was kind of conscripted into. I'd been writing about invention for a while, but I kind of just got hired out of the blue to do this. So suddenly, every week, I was given objects and then asked to find out who originated them. And this turned into a giant, sort of unplanned research project into the sources of new ideas. So here's just a few pictures of the column. Yeah, I have to pull this out. So that, I'm going to arrange things here. Okay, so this was the pencil with the built-in eraser. And then sliced bread was a fun one. Sliced bread actually, when it originally debuted in the 1920s, it came with instructions because people weren't sure how to use it. This was the coffee lid. The coffee lid is the beloved object of barrage inventors. You may have noticed there are many, many, many iterations. So, excuse me, it's kind of a fascinating object. And this object was actually my idea because I think it's kind of amazing that we have a key on our computers that say escape. I always imagine like I'll push it and disappear through a wormhole or something. So at any rate, I began to see, as I did this week after week, and digging through the patent system, talking to a lot of inventors, looking at a lot of histories, and seeing again and again how these ideas came out of nowhere. Often something that seemed to be impossible would become possible because of somebody's idea, or something that seemed completely crazy would start to seem sane because one person, often it was one person, really lobbied for it and loved it. And when I started the column, I had assumed that I would be talking to a lot of engineers in labs or product designers, because these are the people that we pay to come up with brand new ideas. But much to my surprise, actually several very surprising patterns emerged. I'm only going to talk about one now, and that is that I noticed so many of the big ideas did not come from the engineering labs. They came from people who were engaged with a problem. Pilots, lots of doctors, parents, lots of athletes dealing with gear that didn't work so well, or that they were afraid would kill them, or something like that. So, and I'm just going to tell, a pattern, a story. So I actually 5 kind of stories emerged, or patterns emerged. But one of them, the kind of the most robust, was that often the crucial piece of coming up with a new idea involves finding a new problem, which is deceptively hard. It sounds easy because problems are all around us, but it's often very hard to see a problem. And you know, we have that saying, necessity is the mother of invention. But that's not entirely true, because we're always bumping up against needs and frustrations all day long. And at least for me, it rarely leads to a giant breakthrough. So I began thinking about what kind of necessity, what exactly is the variety of the need or frustration? What does it look like when it leads to a big breakthrough? So here is the kind of classic story that I think helps to answer that question. And we begin in the airport in the golden age of flying, the 1960s and 70s. This was a completely different experience than flying today, as many of you may remember. People didn't fly very much, if at all, because it was really expensive. And when you did fly, it was a luxury experience. You sat in a sort of gorgeous lounge like this. If you ate on the plane, it might look like this. And people had different gear when they flew than we do now. Actually, it seems like it was very important to wear plaid at that time. But do you notice anything about the luggage? No wheels, right? Looks bizarre to us now. So this is documented evidence that as you know, in the 1960s, which was not that long ago, nobody really had wheels on their suitcases. And that was because you didn't need a special suitcase for the airport. That would have sounded crazy. You went there maybe once a year, twice a year. And there were a lot of people helping you with your luggage and so on. But as things began to get a little more, people began to fly more often and began to think they maybe did need some special luggage for the airport. A luggage executive named Bernard Sadow came up with this idea. And this was actually kind of took off a bit in the early 70s. I don't know if you can see the wheels on the bottom there. And there's that sort of leash she's got. And so, do you guys see any problems with this design?
Top heavy.
Right, it's going to flop over.
And going up and down stairs, for example.
And what about when you're on a downhill?
Oh, dear.
Right, then it starts attacking you, right, from behind. So, but still, if you're not flying that often, this would do the trick. This would be fine. But if you were a pilot and you were in the airport several times a week, 5 days a week, and you were carrying flight logs, which they used to have to carry with them, and you had tons of luggage with you, then you might quickly notice all the problems we've just mentioned. And on top of that, you would be very motivated to solve this problem because it's physically causing you pain. And so indeed, a pilot named Robert Plath went to his home workshop in the 1980s and made this object that I think all of us probably own, some version of this now. And so I think this, and then another crucial element of this story is that flying became horrible as the airlines deregulated, as prices came down, as more and more people were road warriors and frequent flyers for their jobs. I think there was a Wired story in the 90s titled "Life Sucks and Then You Fly," about how horrible it was. So you would buy anything to ease the pain, right? So now you're kind of like a pilot in some ways, and so you then need this. Now we could live in a different future. Now we could live in a future where there would be robots that would pick up all your luggage, or maybe where we wouldn't be flying so often. So we could have gone into a different future where this object wasn't really appropriate. So that's also relevant. So when answering that question, what kind of problems lead to ideas? If you want to have a good problem, here you go. So the problem should last a long time, because if it's short and you know it will be over, you're okay with the half solution. But bumping up against the problem, feeling pain from it over and over and over again, cracks open our imagination because there's the dread and worry of it happening the next time. And so that, and if you've ever had that experience, as I bet everybody has here, where you are dreading and worrying about something, you become very imaginative. And you begin, your brain turns into like a little R&D lab, and you start running scenarios of all the different ways you could handle the problem. And that can be very productive. And the other element of a good problem is that it should become a much bigger problem in the future and be relevant to a lot more people. And so that is all I have to say about that. And I'm going to then switch us as seamlessly as possible into our bringing Alice Flaherty and Nat Sims up, Dr. Nat Sims up to the stage. I'm not sure how you guys want to just, or you walk. Get the robots. But I wanted to kind of segue, segue into a story that Dr. Sims told me a while ago that I think is very relevant and iconic. about, that really tells us about something about seeing a good problem. And that's the story that starts when Dr. Sims was in the 1980s, was working as an anesthesiologist. And maybe you can take it from there and saw a problem.
Sure, so, hi everybody, how's the microphone working? Can you hear? Great. So, I am 66 and I've been at MGH since 1979, and I want to talk about things that happened a really long time ago, 1985 or so, when I transitioned from being a fellow in cardiac anesthesia and went to England to learn some things, to becoming a young staff. And there were two simultaneous kind of terrible problems that I was faced with. One of them is that the hospital wanted to restart a program in pediatric cardiac surgery. So you had the technical problem of giving tiny volumes of strong drugs to tiny children in a safe way, not just in order to do the surgery, but to move them around the hospital and get them back to the ICU, and if something goes wrong, back to the operating room. All of these kind of life or death issues. And then, so that was one kind of terrible problem, and I don't know why they picked me to sort of focus on it. Maybe I was just the youngest kid on the block at that time. And then the second problem was really a more pervasive problem. And this business about the lucky inventor is the person who happens to be situated in a place where somebody in the world is starting to do something that's going to become a much bigger problem later. And for the care of our adult cardiac surgical patients, our surgeons were very innovative, as well as our cardiologists. In the old days, if a person was having a heart attack, they would come to the emergency ward. You would say, you're having a heart attack, let's put you to rest for 2 weeks and we'll see how you are when it's over. They decided in 1985 to immediately take those patients having a heart attack to the cath lab and to see if there was something they could immediately surgically fix to get blood back to the starving part of the heart. And they would put a heart support device in, and the patients would become extremely ill, and then we would move them to the ICU, and then we would move them to the operating room, and then they would get even sicker after the surgery was done, and we'd have to move them to the ICU, all with dozens of drugs running, and with trying to monitor their physiology, not just in the OR, but in the elevator. At the time, the hospital, the surgeons were so far ahead of our ability to support the ambition of what they were trying to do that the equipment was literally a few generations behind. And if we need to, there's a picture of what one of our ICUs looked like down there in 1985, where once the patients got put in the ICU, I actually brought it over here, Pagan, that one.
This is the before, right?
That's the before. So the patient would arrive on the ICU. This is a patient's head, their feet are down here, and these huge, heavy metal drug infusion pumps are giving the drugs. But if the patient suddenly needs to go to the operating room, there's no way to take them there because the pumps are heavy, they don't have any batteries, etc. And I began to think, this is really terrible. It's somewhat unethical, and it's very scary to suddenly reconfigure everything for this patient just because they have to move around the hospital. So that was the problem, and we'll pause right there.
Oh, okay. Well,
Do you want to tell us how you solved it?
yeah. Well, and I think you said that, you told me that you realized that when the patient became unstable, he or she had 4 minutes to live, but it took 20 minutes to get down the hall, right? So it was...
Sure, so if one of the things that used to happen a lot, not so much anymore, is that after cardiac surgery, perhaps you'd be in the intensive care unit for 6 hours, gradually warming up and getting better, but suddenly bleeding would restart, and that blood pressure drops, the patient's on all kinds of drugs, and yet the only place to solve the problem is to go back to the operating room. And the notion of having to spend 20 minutes untangling all the equipment, mixing new drugs to run by gravity while the patient's unstable in the hallway just was incredibly difficult to feel that it was ethical. And I had to step out of my job description in order to have, in order to focus on a solution, because I didn't think anybody else was going to spend time on it. And as we've talked about before, being given permission by some supervisor or higher up person in the organization who can give you permission to step out of your job description, focus on something, make some mistakes, but at least they know about it and they support you, is a key part of starting to innovate. That lets you bring other people into it and form a team, so it's not just you beavering away in your machine shop trying to design a new device, or a new principle on how the work should be done, or a new agreement among all the 22,000 employees of the hospital that we're going to do things in a more standardized way, because standardization is so key to safety. So
how did you get that 20 minutes down to the 4 minutes where the patient could be in a patient room, I guess, and then wheeled through the hospital and then ready to go in the OR?
Sure. So the most important motivator was that I had an opportunity in July of 1987 to go visit. I know this is hard to believe that there's another hospital in the world that does things better than MGH, but I visited a hospital. It was the Cleveland Clinic in the summer of 1987, where they had decided to set up a huge cardiac surgical program, care for patients from all over the world. They built an entirely new building, and every operating room and every ICU cubicle was spacious. The elevators were bigger than this podium, and they literally put hydraulic arms in the ceiling and these giant stainless steel racks that all the heavy equipment could be mounted on, and it would drop down into the bed, and the patients could go back and forth in seconds if things got wrong. I said, yikes! This is much harder to feel ethical about the way we're doing things here now that I know there's some place doing it better. And so I obviously couldn't install hydraulic columns in MGH's ancient buildings. So we had to take that idea that we got from the people that were doing things better and modify it to this environment. So we made a sort of an arrangement that allowed, well, where's the other picture? So within 2 years, we solved the problems of the gigantic infusion pumps that couldn't be moved by going up to a company in New Hampshire to make these cool little tiny battery-powered calculator infusion pumps that you could put 12 on this little metal rack. The metal rack could jump mechanically from a bed to a roll-around stand in the OR or to a roll-around stand in the ICU. But more fundamental to just the technology that we physically hacked together and then got companies to make was the socio-technical aspect of it, which is the people that were leaders in the hospital agreeing that having people do things in a standardized fashion across different care environments, as opposed to the patient going from one kingdom to another kingdom, and every time they crossed the threshold, they would take off stuff and put their stuff on. And so I think that's what we did. I worked with a friend of mine who was an industrial designer. I made some things in my own machine shop. I spent a lot of time up in Manchester, New Hampshire at a little company founded famously by Dean Kamen, who had one of the first pick-and-place machines to make miniaturized electronic circuitry boards that were very rare in those days, but now totally common. And we made little drug infusion pumps that also embedded within them the safe practices of how the drug should be given, so that some of these errors that also bothered us, where we found maybe a baby who needed a life support drug to get ready for cardiac surgery wasn't having an effect, you'd find the tattered piece of paper where people were making hand calculations and mixing the drugs themselves and realize, whoops, I think somebody didn't multiply or divide by 60, the drug dose is too small. We tried to solve those problems for the workforce as well. And so suddenly from just being a guy faced with a difficult set of problems that were being experienced by a leading institution doing things kind of in a second horizon way, I found myself both doing mechanical engineering, mechanical design, but also creating regulated medical devices, which then have to pass all of the FDA certifications for safety and efficacy, and all of the patents and patent applications, and so you sort of find yourself moving from one space to another as life gets complicated. And you also, as we might point out, just because you find a problem and you solve it, you can't walk away. You own the problem for the next 30 years or until you say, time to retire. Because if you are solving a difficult problem, but you solve it in a way that might once in 1,000 times create a worse problem, the patient is hit on the head by the equipment that you made a way to hold in the vicinity of their head, you're going to get a phone call. And so for each of these projects we'll talk about tonight, there probably were 50 different iterations and need to redesign it every 5 years when something else changed, or each solution brings up a new set of problems or opportunities, and so you tend to kind of own the situation that you walked into for a couple decades.
Yeah, and I think one of the piece of that story I love the most is that part of the solution was just this simple rack, right, that really allowed the bed, then you had a sort of one plug situation where you could plug the patient in and then move that person down the hall and sort of plug them in. But this rack is such a simple, in hindsight, seems like such a simple, obvious solution. And often the best solutions have that kind of sense of, I could have thought of that, but nobody did, like the rolling suitcase. And so Alice, I wanted to talk to you about that, how we get blocked, where a solution that later seems completely obvious, like we cannot believe we didn't see it. How do we not see those things? And I should mention that Alice Flaherty has written an enormous amount of beautiful writing about creativity and her own process, and also treats patients for movement disorders and thinks a lot about maintaining their creativity. So that's why I'm asking you the creativity question.
So, because I'm trained as a neurologist, the thing that interests me is what is going on in people's brains when they're creative and also when they're not. And I think from the point of view of someone who's not a neurologist, exactly what's going on in terms of chemicals is not so important. But it is useful to know a few things, and one is that this point of getting blocked in terms of solutions. Often there's a psychological explanation is when we're exposed to bad solutions, as Pagan described in her book, often even though we know it's a bad solution, it influences us to try and modify the bad solution and not to think out of the box. And so that's at a sort of psychological level we can describe it. And then there's also the neurological level, which is there is a part of our brain, the frontal lobes, which help us break out of that box. Now, here's one myth I want to dispel. A lot of writers will say, oh, well, I need to drink before I write because I need to squash my frontal lobes. Like, that's where my superego is, and I'll be more creative. Don't do that. The frontal lobes are actually really important for you. And they're the things that get you not to be in that rut. So they've done studies where they look at creative people versus not, and the creative frontal lobes are more active. So alcohol, not so good. We can talk about that later. But if you have patients with brain lesions, they'll just try the same solution over and over again. We all do that. Like you put a quarter in, these days it's like 7 quarters in the Coke machine, and nothing comes out. A lot of times you'll just put more money in and like bang on it. No, you should just change your approach, go to a store. So, so there are many things, many ways in which what our brain is doing can predict what we would do, even not talking about pills and like what to put in your body, but what might be a way of getting out of a block.
And Nat, did you want to talk about some of the work that you're doing now? You're describing some incredible stuff to me.
Well, sure. One of the things that, well, of the different 8 or 10 different inventions that I worked on over the last 25 years, 1 or 2 of them surprisingly became very successful in terms of the whole world deciding that they needed it. And the particular problem that I stumbled into was the one I briefly mentioned of people making well-intentioned but serious calculation errors in the course of mixing life support drugs for sick people or not sick people, and or also simply misprogramming a device that's giving a therapy. And so in the course of trying to solve the problem of the baby who wasn't getting better because there was a calculation error, I came up with an invention that others called smart drug infusion pumps, which had the capability of pumping the fluid, but also had the capability for any hospital customer to create their entire formulary of correct drug-giving practices and upload it into the pumps so that when the user was standing in front of a device with a bag of XYZ drug, it would just know all of the things that you ought to know. And also, if you misprogrammed it, it would sort of say, do you really want to do that? And give you a chance to rethink what you were doing. So this, a long way around to the question of how we're trying to accelerate innovation here. But we were, the patent application that we innocently wrote in October of 1992 suddenly seemed to need to be licensed all over the world. So it brought in a substantial amount of money to the hospital, which then gave us a fund with which we could invest in the inventions of other young folks at MGH. And we tried to do it, and I'm looking at Harry DeMonico because he and I worked together on this. We tried to think about how to sort of amp up the inventive energy of the 22,000 employees at MGH by offering a service which we call the Innovation Support Center, a couple of buildings away here in MGH. And anybody with a problem or a solution could come and talk to Harry and Christiana and Arun. And they, over the course of a couple of years, I think interviewed probably 250 different people with a range of interesting problems and interesting solutions. And but then it developed that each department of the hospital, and there are probably 15 or 20 departments, decided to have their own chief innovation officer and focus on problems and solutions within their specialty, neurology, anesthesia, whatever. And now my focus has been on those new innovations coming from our anesthesia department. As anybody knows who's walked around in this museum, MGH was the first place where ether anesthesia was provided, and we see a new opportunity to totally transform the practice of surgery and anesthesia again by giving the drugs that we use to provide anesthesia based on a very sensitive reading of the brain state through processing the EEG. And so I have invested from my innovation fund a couple of $1 million in work done by 3 fabulous investigators here at MGH to put in place the building blocks for a new generation of personalized anesthesia care in which the drugs are given in a sort of auto-adjusted or auto-titrated way, and with the expectation that we may greatly reduce inadvertent overdosing of people in surgery or in the ICU, where sedation is provided in a much more ad hoc way. And those of you who are medically sophisticated will know that if you're in the ICU, you don't really want to be in burst suppression. You just like to be sedated. So that is now a flagship project, and we've invested tremendous amount of multidisciplinary support because it's often said that of every 1,000 amazing new inventions, only one of them becomes a company that sells one of anything, and then of 1,000 little companies like that that are acquired by bigger companies, only 1 in 1,000 makes it across the chasm to success. Sometimes things have to be invented 7 or 8 times before the true breakthrough happens. And so I'd say that's what I'm up to, is just trying to support our young inventors here.
If I could jump in a little bit and riff on what you were saying about brain states, because your goal of encouraging innovation has been, it's so admirable. And one of the interesting things about how creativity is spread is that it's kind of contagious. And I think it was even Aristotle that first talked about the muse being contagious and being spread from one person to another. In neural terms, we can explain that in terms of there's a mirror neuron system, or a more complicated system that will allow us to imitate other people's behavior and kind of forces us to. But in psychological terms, you can see over and over again where there's a creative person, other people start to get excited about ideas and about invention too. Actually, I want to tell a story about a patient of mine who was a mechanic, is a mechanic, and I always wanted to see his workshop. And finally, after we'd been patients for he'd been my patient for like 5 years, I got to see this place. This is Bill Taylor, who's sitting in the front row and didn't know this was going to happen to him. This is like that like dinner theater where it's interactive and all of a sudden you're broken into the performance. So I finally got there, and it turned out it was this kind of mecca for everyone in the neighborhood to come and work on stuff. And Bill sat there like kind of like King Solomon and would like tell people how they could fix their well, he doesn't deal with lawnmowers anymore. It's like that's beneath him. But let's say their Model T Ford or everything that they were working on, and everyone in the community would come to him. It was really a wonderful kind of salon in a engineering kind of way. So I got in there and I saw he had like 4 lathes, and I suddenly wanted to make something out of metal. And that's actually the result. The invention that I have downstairs is an example of where inventions can, like how close they are to crazy. So that's really just crazy. It's not useful. But what inspired it was seeing all these great tools and thinking they need to do something. I want to use them. And that kind of drive that people have to use tools and to make stuff is something that really creative people can inspire in others. And I just want to mention 2 of his inventions. One was the first and I think only portable iron lung. So this is a guy who his job in life was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of it was making prototypes for companies that were doing hydraulics. So it had nothing to do with medicine. But a neighbor down the street had polio, and she was in an iron lung, and she really wanted to go be able to see her son's basketball games. This is in what, the 50s or 60s? And so Bill was like, oh, I can help with that. And after, I'm sure, a long time, he managed to come up with a portable iron lung that she could use. And Arlene, his daughter, who's a cardiac nurse here, remembers going, like, as a little kid, I imagine you holding his hand as you go up the steps of the split level to go and adjust this thing. And that is just like, first of all, it was like you did it for free. It was this wonderful example of just kind of the amount of empathy and helpingness that engineering devices can do. And but I have to mention the other device, and then I'll shut up, which was he took a VW, cut like a big slice out of the middle, stuffed it together so he could then convert it into like a little forklift that he could use around his property. And then a couple years later, when that wasn't useful to him anymore, he put treads on it, and his kids used it as a snowmobile. So now it's stuck.
Well, Alice, if I could
I'm going to
just...
rip off that.
Okay, well, hold on, but I just wanted to amplify or make a little plug for your invention downstairs that you're going to display for all who want to see you working, using it. But you told me that you were also motivated. So Alice made this machine that takes sweaters, cashmere sweaters that you get from the Goodwill for $4 and unravels them into expensive balls of yarn. And you told me part of it was, well, can you talk about the something out of nothing?
Well, you know, that was actually a pourquoi story. The real reason that I did it was a medical issue, which was that I would get fidgety and grand rounds, and I would start to play with my iPhone. It's like this tool use thing. I needed something to do with my hands so that I would pay attention. So the standard thing for women to do is knitting, and I really did not want to learn to knit. And finally, I sort of faced up that I would have to do it. And that was when I saw Bill's shop, and I thought, I totally said, oh, I'm going to make a unraveling machine to get the yarn, and it kept me from having to learn how to knit for another year or so while I built that. But so the main thing that this was to do was just to give me a distraction from learning how to knit, which I now finally can do. But the reason that that I then told people was, oh, I was going to make money selling cashmere yarn, which is quite expensive, and but that, like, a lot of times, the reason I bring up the idea of a pourquoi story is that inventors are not that accurate about what they tell us about how they invented things. And I'm sure Pagan has a lot of great examples of that from her own experiences.
Well, do you want to go with your?
Well, I just wanted to riff off what Alice said, that in terms of ways we're supporting innovation here at MGH. So in earlier generations, you know, we would get scars on our knuckles from working on cars, right? This generation of young anesthesia residents have made a proposal to take over one of the rooms in Ruth Sleeper Hall and create what they're calling a shared workspace. And we have found a budget with which to buy them the first thing that they want, which is...
Is it a 3D printer?
Yeah, 3D
Can I
printer.
use it?
Of course! You have to join the club. And not only did they want just a 3D printer, but they wanted a 3D printer from Formlabs company that was an SLA printer, which we thought, wow, why do they want that? Because it's kind of more brittle material, stereolithographic, as opposed to FDM. But they have a very specific reason for wanting that printer, so one of my mechanical engineers, Mike Wallowitz, is going to buy it for them and support it. And some of these young anesthesia residents have taught themselves how to do 3D modeling with AutoCAD, and already came up with some prototypes for cool accessories to anesthesia devices that won prizes at big conventions. And I think we're literally on the edge of opening this little shared innovation workspace. It also happens to be next door in that same building to the most beautiful machine shop any hospital ever had, which I've spent many years in. And so I think the future is incredibly bright, but each generation is going to ask for different tools with which to kinesthetically experience this amazing desire on people's part to make things. And I was telling Pagan that I grew up, my dad was a physician. We moved to northern Vermont. We lived on a kind of 4-acre old farm. And you know, there are pictures of me as a 6-year-old trying to dangerously drive tractors. And just all kinds of things that I was allowed to fool around in the workshop, in the basement, because my dad liked to collect old tools, and it was always, you know, we never bought something new. We would fix the broken old one. So I think a lot of this traceability to all the things we do in our lives, but each generation is going to do it in their way.
So one of the great points Pagan makes in her book is a sort of egalitarian view of innovation, where even some of these very high-tech ideas, like the 3D printer, came out of individual people working on their own. And I hope you'll tell the story of your friend that actually invented using ketchup and saccharin packets.
Oh, yeah. So this is a local story. Well, actually, yeah, the first 3D printer actually came out of a guy who worked in a UV lab or UV lamp making factory, where his idea had absolutely no meaning or relevance. So, which is also kind of a classic story, which is he hadn't been, you know, his boss didn't want him to do it. And I saw a lot of inventors who had to really find a way, because they were essentially starting a whole new industry
or they had some idea that just didn't make sense. You know, if back in the 80s you were talking about making a Star Trek replicator and essentially you worked in a lab that just made UV lights, you know, nobody would be very interested. So that was one story. But then actually here at MIT, after there were the sort of very 3D printing had just gotten started, but the machines were like $500,000. They were not able to do that. They were limited in what they could do, and so there were a lot of people and a lot of companies and universities trying to get them to run faster, cheaper, and to be able to do things like print on the inside of the sphere or something like that. And so there was a guy who I was friends with in the 90s named Tim Anderson, who was living in Building 20, if any of you guys remember that wonderful building. He was actually did not go to MIT, he just had wandered in off the street and was squatting there and living under a robot that he made. And at one point he was in a dumpster behind Building 35 where there was a team of people trying to make a new kind of 3D printer. And he sort of pops up and they found, and thus he meets the team. And when they saw the work he'd done on his robot that he was living under, they said, you know what, we need you to help us make this machine. They were trying to do a very, very complex machine that they were building around this idea of printing with a kind of powder, ceramic powder. It was very complex. But Tim and his friend Jim Brett decided that they would make their own version of a 3D printer just for parties out of stuff from the trash. So they first tried with kitty litter. They had this kitty litter machine that would glob together kitty litter, but it didn't really work very well. And they were using actually parts that they had scavenged from I believe it was dots, wasn't it? Yeah, inkjet printers, the printheads.
Right.
And no, just actually that was a different kind of, that was another guy. But so they were spraying, but they got the idea of the spraying the powder. And they were using these inkjet heads that they just scavenged. And then they began instead of thinking about the machines, they decided to just use the machines they got out of the trash and think about what material they could use that would work in these trash pick parts. And they realized that Sweet and Low worked really well. It was also free because they could steal it from the cafeteria. So they made this printer for a party, and it turned out to be the fastest printer in the world at that time. And it had cost under $100 to make, which I think also kind of gets at the amazing creative power of not trying to make a profit because they were completely unimpeded by any notions of.
Yeah, if I could reframe that a little, when you brought up the question of what kind of necessity drives invention, in a lot of ways, play drives some of these inventions, and even in inventions where you're really trying to save someone's life, it's almost always someone else's life. It's very, very hard to do creative work when your life is under, you're in front of the gun. And there's some studies that show that interest and curiosity and desire are better drivers of creativity than fear and shame and things like that. And one of the side effects of that is the way when we think about how we train, say, graduate students and residents, it's a lot easier for big institutions to instill fear, like, well, you're not going to get a job, than it is to make them curious about their projects. And so I've actually treated people for, say, like creative block on their thesis and so forth. And I'll say, well, we need to treat your horrible anxiety. And they'll say, well, you can't do that because if I'm not anxious, I can't work anymore. And they've been it's like Stockholm syndrome, where they've so much absorbed the values of their captors that they can't remember that they used to have a whole nother drive system. There's two drive systems in all mammals' brains. One is a fear running away from things system, and then there's a approach going towards stuff you like system. And for them, their poor little approach systems have atrophied. So, I think all of us try to encourage our residents to screw off every once in a while and just experiment. But, one other aspect of that is people do better on creative tests if they take propranolol in front of them, because propranolol just lowers their effects of their adrenaline. And adrenaline makes you act in very rigid ways. So the reason that, like, necessity, Neanderthals all had a lot of necessity, right? Ancient man did, but they had the wrong kind. They had the kind that if you do it wrong, you die. So they had to do things in a pretty regimented way that they knew were going to work, because experimentation, 99% of the time, produces just like a pile of kitty litter that looks like a turd. So it's better to be in a safe environment and not be driven by fear when you can get it.
And speaking of not being driven by fear, I was wondering if we should open this up to questions from the audience, because I can see lots of people out there who look like they're kind of
Not afraid.
not afraid or are harboring a very interesting question.
Has MGH ever partnered with MIT Media Lab on any type of medical technology?
I mean, unless you have an answer, I have an answer.
I can think of one, but you go.
Oh, you go, well.
No.
So there have, there's been so many connections between MIT and MGH that at one point there was a worry that the two were going to run away and form their own medical schools. And Harvard Medical School invented the HST program, the Joint Program of trying to squelch that. The Media Lab in particular, I know of a few projects that have been underway. One is people with autism. They've developed these devices that will help people with autism identify expressions in real time. One device that I think is so useful for doctors who often sort of acquire autistic characteristics when they want to shut their patients up, like they don't make eye contact and they speak rapidly and use jargon. And so we get in these monologues, and the guys at the Media Lab developed something called the monologue monitor. And all it does is it sits on your hips like a little beeper-sized thing, and it listens to your speech patterns. And if you talk for more than 2 minutes in an uninterrupted spiel like I'm doing right now, it buzzes, it shocks you in the hip and gets you to shut up and say to the patient, or to, whoever you're talking to, and what do you think about, the problem? So that's one of the things that the Media Lab has been involved in.
Yeah, the other Media Lab story that I really liked, I had a chance to make a presentation with one of the Media Lab folks who was working on making a modification to an iPhone that could literally be taken around the world and be shined into someone's eye and immediately figure out what kind of reading glasses was appropriate to them. And the numbers were staggering. There's something like 2 billion people on Earth whose just aging vision makes it hard for them to read, and for $5 each you can rent. And so just this amazing creative energy out of the Media Lab to tackle problems like that across a huge scale. It's just so thrilling.
Now I'm just going to be a little cynical here, because an even lower tech solution is the person with the aging eyes just tries a couple of different reading glasses and sees which one works best.
Actually,
And then you had a story in the book about that.
Yeah. The problem of detecting which glasses people need is actually a huge problem, because.
But not for presbyopia. But yeah, go on and talk about the more complicated glasses.
Oh, just like
real glasses.
Yeah, the nearsighted
people.
Yeah, that is a huge problem.
But you had a story about bringing the factory to
there is.
the locations.
Saul Griffith created a little factory, and I saw it and talked to him in the early 2000s. A little suitcase-sized factory. It was brilliant. That could manufacture the lenses in any shape or size that you needed, so that you could diagnose people on the spot. The figures, it's somewhere between like 500 million and 1 billion people don't have access to prescription lenses across the world. So this is a huge problem. So many people have been trying to figure it out. He ultimately realized his factory wasn't good enough because it just couldn't deliver a cheap enough price point, even though it was pretty cheap. And so it's beginning to look like the solution is to have, say, 100 prescriptions for nearsightedness, and then maybe use an iPhone or just a
traveling optician or somebody like that. And then just pair people with glasses that are made in a big factory. That may be the cheapest. But this still is this problem of delivering the eye care as well is really huge, because it's not just the glasses, it's the access to the person who can see the problems. So,
Riffing on the thought,
Yeah.
you look at the.
You guys should stop us when we
Yeah,
have
I know,
super
but
long
we need more
answers.
yeah, maybe we
questions.
should get another question
More questions.
before. Yes.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about creativity or invention with partnerships of, for lack of a better term, like interdisciplinary teams or, a variety of viewpoints.
So I think a great example of, we all know that creativity happens very easily on the edges of things, because you can take something that's been worked out in one field and import it into another, and a lot of the work's already been done. A guy who has been wonderful at that is Atul Gawande, who you probably know as a New Yorker writer. But one of the things he's well known for is taking the safety checklists from the aeronautics industry and bringing them into the OR. And on the one hand, this is one of these very simple things that you say, well, that's like obvious. The only reason that ever happened, I think, is because Atul has so much charisma and charm that he managed to get the surgeons who hated those lists to finally adopt them. So there was a huge amount of, like, as Pagan would describe it, like ethnographic research to, like, he knew that population because he is a surgeon. But he was able to take a whole system that had already been worked out over decades and bring it into medicine. And a key thing he did was change the language, because the terms were so alien to a lot of people that until he wrote it in medicalese, it was just like garbage.
Well, maybe just two other quick thoughts to your question. One is, I think if you look at NIH grants that are or opportunities, or DARPA grants coming at the Boston area, so many of them basically say we won't even read your grant unless you are a collaboration between 2 or 3 teams from 2 or 3 different institutions that nobody ever would have thought made sense. So I think there's a tremendous amount of financial incentive for people to partner in unusual ways. Another example would be over at on the MIT campus is the Koch Center for Integrated Cancer Research, where they're just a giant building full of people from multiple different engineering and other disciplines, just trying to think of every possible new and unusual way to deliver cancer drugs to targeted locations and so on. And so this Boston, I think, is a really great city for clumping people together in creative teams. One other point that Eric von Hippel, who we've mentioned several times and is such a mentor to us at MGH and in the city about innovation, 2 things there. Eric talks about lead user innovators, which is kind of someone like me. Then he talks about user innovation communities. So that's a whole big topic, and particularly in the patient disease groups like diabetics working together to come up with new ways to care for themselves. But Eric also makes a fascinating point about can you create protected spaces for innovation in which groups of people can tackle things on the edge. And the best example that I can think of, and Eric says if you look at a space, a domain of activity like aviation, and you have a line of government regulation. Above that line is regulated products, and below the line is not regulated products. And so the government can often stimulate innovation by allowing, for example, the Experimental Aircraft Association to be a huge community of people who want to build aircraft that are untraditional, and the government permits them to fly and to inspect them in certain ways, but to have much more freedom to be innovative. And so I think this issue of how do you take active steps, whether you're a regulator or an institution like MGH or a granting agency, to really amp up innovative energy. There's many ways of looking at it.
Anybody have another question? Yes.
So when you developed your device in the ICU unit. You were in a place where you almost knew that it would work, right? I mean, trial and error, you almost knew this was 100 times better than what you already had, those big machines. And you mentioned the word regulation and FDA approval. So did you have to go through clinical trial for FDA approval of safety and efficacy?
So, great question. Oftentimes, in those days, we would partner with some small innovative company that was interested in doing something edgy and risky and new. And so it would be, and we'd either bring the engineers from the company into our environment or abstract the problem in such a way that we could bring the problem and the proposed solution to the company engineers. And then, you know, there'd be a nice dividing line between us as the place where clinical trials and all of that could be done, and their job was to create the FDA paperwork and approval. In the specific case of drug infusion pumps in 1987, the regulatory approval for a new device was based on the concept of a predicate device. So the filing of the company to get the device approved would basically say, this is actually just like a device that was, you know, used in medical practice before 1976, the sort of domino theory of the justification for a new medical device. In 2010, the FDA changed entirely the guidance for how devices should be designed, the documentation, the safety assurance cases, the failure modes and effects analysis, et cetera, the paperwork that has to be submitted. And they were going to say that they couldn't approve anything that didn't have extensive clinical trials in the real world environment. But then they modified it to a better way, which is to say the human factors of the device has to be formally tested in a simulation lab that replicates the experience of the healthcare environment and tested with caregivers, physicians and nurses from every discipline who might ever be likely to use that device, and that they had to be tested in stressful environments when they're tired, they're taking care of 3 simulated patients at once, everything's going wrong, the radio's blaring. And so, not to go on too long about regulatory science, but what really changed between the 1980s and the present in approval of medical devices is that the user is in the box. Therefore, you have to prove that the device can be safely used by a realistic user, not a hypothetical perfect user who's read the manual, knows everything, and is going to operate it perfectly. And this has been a fascinating transformation. So we tend to go to the University of Toronto simulation labs, and most of the companies do the human factors approval. And I'm really excited to be a taxpayer with respect to new changes that the FDA has undertaken that are making it a much more rational process of getting approval for new medical devices.
I was wondering to what extent is it important in the innovation process to have somebody that's too stupid to know you can't do something, so he or she just goes out and does it?
Sure, so I'd love to tackle that because, in fact, I spent a couple hours in the last couple days looking up a series of articles about that very topic. And in fact, I can't remember the name of the article, but in 1992, somebody named Nye, N-Y-E, wrote this fabulous article or book, which basically said the successful innovator or business person or entrepreneur who we all worship as the example of whether it's Henry Ford or Edison or Gates, they're just the lucky fool who didn't know enough to know that what they were trying to do was impossible, and they went ahead and did it anyway, and they were literally just, and the phrase lucky fool is celebrated from that article. And so the notion that the person on the podium is just the person who had such a disdain for the rational thinking about whether they could solve their problem that they just stumbled into a solution, and then everybody said, wow,
Which means that there are a whole lot of other unlucky fools
Right.
that are asking for government money and doing these horrible jobs.
Right.
But I think an interesting way to phrase that when you say too stupid, I think better to say too uninformed, because you really don't want stupid people doing the experiment. But people that often have come from outside a discipline they don't have the solution fix of knowing bad solutions to the problem that are influencing them. But in terms of being brilliant, there's some evidence in creativity research that being brilliant isn't so useful just in terms of high IQ, that it's the motivation that's key. And there's some studies that show that over an IQ of like 115, kind of pretty smart but not genius, it doesn't really make that much difference to be much smarter in terms of what you invent. It's just you care so much about it, you think about it all the time. On the other side of it though, like below 115, it matters. Like the more IQ points you lose, the less likely you are to invent something.
Yeah, and I'd like to amplify that another of the patterns I noticed as I was working on my column and then my book was, well, first of all, there's just an enormous amount of what we call accidental or serendipitous inventions. And it's often in the realm of drug discovery is a big place where that happens, where somebody's trying to make one thing and then they come up with something else. Viagra is one. Actually, artificial sweeteners, to get back to sweet and low, every artificial sweetener I could find came about because somebody was trying to make something else and then noticed this sweet taste. And often you couldn't have predicted that the compound would be sweet ahead of time because the components weren't sweet. But the person who really taught me about this accidental invention and that there's a crucial piece is motivation, and I would say love behind these, is it's not just important to have the accident, because you can find all kinds of people who had exactly the same kind of accident and didn't notice it or care about it or go forward with it. For instance, in radiology, I think there were people who noticed that these photographic plates had cloudy images on them and they thought they were just sent them back to the manufacturer or whatever, and then they're, so the key thing is to really become curious. And there's an inventor I interviewed named Lonnie Johnson, who was a NASA engineer in the 80s, and he was making this nozzle to go in some kind of heat pump, and he was testing it in his bathroom, and the nozzle, there was something about the design of it, it was so powerful that the water was coming out and just kind of flying across the bathroom and splatting on the wall with this kind of cartoony effect. And he fell in love with that. I mean, completely fell in love with it and was convinced it would be a toy and that he could make this squirt gun. And he spent, the 80s was not a good time for independent inventors, and he spent almost a decade he made an entire prototype of his squirt gun and everything, and went around to toy fairs, and was just, he was really just not getting any traction because it was such a new kind of product. And finally, somebody licensed it, and it became the Super Soaker. But, I kept going over with him until I think I was driving him crazy a little bit. Like, what was it about that nozzle that kept you going for 10 years? And he was just describing, it was like, I've seen water come out of different nozzles. It wasn't exciting, but when I saw that, and I just thought love at first sight, like when you see somebody fall in love with, and then I began noticing in other stories that same component of somebody hears a sound or they see a weird pattern of light and they get so excited about it. It really is a falling in love, so it's not just stupidity, it's the love that keeps you, or the passion that keeps you going for all the many horrible years where you're bankrupt and everybody's turning down your idea.
I must say, I'm inspired by this to think there needs to be a next version of the Inventology book that really looks at medical inventions, and maybe particularly just so that it's manageable, medical inventions from the Boston area or from MGH. For example, John Parrish is the person here who essentially changed the therapy of psoriasis, which people may remember. In the old days, if you had severe psoriasis, you were admitted to the hospital once every 6 months and literally smeared with coal tar and saran wrap, which would be on you for, I don't know, a week at a time, and then it would come off and you'd go out and be okay for 6 months. I mean, obviously a very difficult therapy. John Parrish, and I don't know the story, I'm dying to know it, conceived of the notion of taking a particular drug orally, which would be a photosensitizing agent, and then exposing the body to a certain wavelength of light. And that, first of all, what amazing moment caused him to think of that. My office at Nassau Street is in John Parrish's suite, and they just brought in the original lens that he used to form the correct wavelength of light, and there's a wonderful book that's just been published about the Wellman Laboratory for Photomedicine, which has gone on to do a huge number of cool things with light and therapy. But there's just so much richness of stories that I don't think have ever been told in any kind of narrative that is fun to read and could peer into what was happening at that moment that John decided to do that. Harry, you know the story?
No, he's told me and I've forgotten it.
There you go.
Sarah, what's our time looking like?
So I think we're going to have to end it here. But anyone who would like to see Alice's Unraveler, she will be manning the Unraveler near the bottom of the stairs, and then we'll whisk Pagan down to the back where she will be signing her books. So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.